Frank Miller had always believed that a man's life could be measured by the land he kept and the promises he honored. On most mornings, the Texas sky greeted him with wide, unbroken streaks of pale gold, the kind of dawn that stretched its arms slowly, like a sleepy animal waking from a deep rest. But on this particular morning, the light felt colder, as if the sun itself hesitated before climbing into another day. Frank rose before it, like he had since he was 16 years old, when responsibility first laid its heavy hand on his shoulder. He pushed open the creaking screen door, letting that early chill seep across his face. The world outside was silent and open, unchanging in its familiar solitude. Rolling fields of brittle grass, weathered fence posts, and the distant silhouettes of his cattle grazing near the far creek. He stepped off the porch, boots sinking slightly into the dew-moistened dirt, and inhaled deeply. The ranch smelled the same as it always did: dust, hay, and something undeniably alive. It was Mary's favorite scent. She used to stand next to him on mornings like this, arms folded, eyes half closed, whispering that the world felt big enough to hold every last dream we've got. Her laughter, warm and bright, still echoed in corners of his memory he rarely allowed himself to disturb. It had been almost 8 years since she passed, but sometimes he still turned his head expecting to see her hair catching the light, her smile forming before she even spoke. He touched the brim of his hat, a small habit, a silent greeting to her, and walked toward the barn. That ritual, like everything else on this land, held a history no outsider could ever fully understand. The barn stood with the weary dignity of many years, its red paint faded into a soft, dusty rose. As Frank opened the large sliding door, a low groan resonated from its old tracks. The familiar smell of grain and old wood washed over him. His boots thudded against the concrete floor as he moved to the feed trough, scooping grain into buckets. His joints cracked in protest, but he ignored it. Work was the only real medicine he trusted. Outside, the cattle had noticed his movement and were already ambling closer, their low grunts rolling through the morning air. He swung the barn door open, carried the buckets toward the corral, and laid them out with steady precision. The cattle pushed and jostled one another, their heavy bodies rumbling like small storms. "Settle down, you greedy things," Frank muttered under his breath, though his voice held no real irritation. He leaned against the fence for a moment, letting the morning settle into place. Somewhere in the distance, a lone hawk cried from the skies above, circling lazily in search of prey. Life on the ranch was quiet, predictable. Though some would say lonely, Frank found comfort in the land's steady rhythms. It kept him anchored in a world that had grown increasingly loud and unfamiliar. But he also knew change had a way of creeping into a man's life without permission. When he heard the hum of engines rolling up the long dirt road that cut through his property, his shoulders stiffened. Cars were rare out here, visitors even rarer. He stood perfectly still as the sound grew louder, the low, polished purr of something expensive. Moments later, 2 black SUVs appeared, their tinted windows flashing briefly as they passed through beams of sunlight. Dust billowed behind them like a ghostly tail. They slowed near the house. Frank didn't move. He watched quietly, the way a weathered oak watches a storm forming on the horizon. The vehicles came to a stop, doors opening in perfect mechanical sequence. 3 men stepped out, suits pressed, shoes polished, hair sculpted with unnatural precision. They walked as though the ground existed solely for them to step on. The man in the center, taller than the others with a cleft chin and a smile too white to trust, approached first. "Mr. Miller?" the man called out, extending a hand. Frank didn't take it. "You're on my property," the old rancher said, voice steady but guarded. The smile flickered, just faintly, before the man let his hand fall. "Of course. My apologies. I'm Richard Langley, Regional Representative for Silver Rock Development." Frank squinted against the light, silent. "We've been trying to reach you," Langley continued. Quite a few letters, phone calls, emails. Don't use email, Frank said simply. Right, Langley replied with a courteous laugh. Well, we'll get straight to business then. Silver Rock is expanding a new industrial zone, and your ranch sits in an ideal location. We'd like to offer you a purchase agreement. A very generous one, in fact. The two men behind him opened briefcases. Papers rustled. Contracts gleamed under clear plastic sheets. Frank didn't look at them. How'd you say you found my place? He asked instead. Oh, we have a very thorough land registry team, Langley replied in a rehearsed tone. We identify ideal lots for future commercial development, analyze region-by-region potential. You're wasting your breath, Frank interrupted. This land ain't for sale. The smile snapped for a fraction of a second, but then returned, tighter, colder, practiced. We understand sentimental attachment, Langley said gently. It's quite common among long-term property owners, but our offer is extremely fair. More than fair, really. He gestured toward the papers. Frank kept his gaze fixed on the man, unmoving as the wind. No amount is fair if it means losing what ain't yours to take, he said. One of the men behind Langley cleared his throat. The atmosphere thickened. Langley straightened his posture. Mr. Miller, we truly hope this conversation can remain cordial. But please understand, this project is already in motion. The surrounding acreage is being negotiated as we speak. You don't want to be the last holdout. It rarely ends well for anyone. Frank didn't blink. I ain't moving. Silence followed, heavy, stretched, and vaguely threatening. Very well, Langley said, collecting the documents with forced calm. We'll give you time to think it over. I've thought it over, Frank replied sharply. The men exchanged glances, then turned back toward their vehicles. Dust rose again as they drove away, their black silhouettes shrinking into the distance. Frank stood still long after they'd disappeared, his jaw clenched tight. Something about the encounter left a sour taste in his mouth. There was no talk of community benefit, no real transparency, only insistence draped in polite language. He knew corporations well enough to understand. When they wanted something, they moved like a river, cold, unstoppable, and unconcerned with whatever they swept away. Still, he didn't know how bad things were about to get. That night, as he sat in his kitchen with only the hum of the old refrigerator filling the quiet, he found the envelope on his table. Someone must have shoved it under the front door. The paper was thick and stiff, the kind that creaked softly when opened. Inside lay a more official version of the contract and a typed note clipped to the top. For your convenience, we expect cooperation, no signature. Frank set the papers aside, unease curling like smoke in his stomach. The next day, a county inspector arrived unannounced. He cited minor violations Frank had never heard of. Fence too deteriorated in one area, livestock count needing verification, soil runoff concerns despite no recent rain. It felt orchestrated, like a performance. Frank complied, but he watched the man closely. Days later, an anonymous complaint triggered a tax review. Then a water quality assessment. Then a routine cattle health check by men Frank had never seen wearing badges he didn't recognize. Everywhere he turned, someone new appeared with a clipboard and forced smile. Silver Rock wasn't negotiating. They were tightening a noose. Frank refused to budge. He fixed what he could fix, paid what he had to pay, and endured what he couldn't control. But he began to feel the land tremble under the weight of unwelcome eyes watching from unmarked cars parked along the boundary line. Still, he clung to his promise. He had told Mary he would keep this land alive as long as he did. Frank's stubbornness wasn't born of pride. It was born of love, a deep-rooted loyalty to everything they'd built together. He didn't know then that the land itself was keeping a secret, something buried deep below the fields he had worked his whole life, something Silver Rock already suspected but desperately hoped he wouldn't discover. And the land revealed that secret on a day that began like any other. The sun was sharp and merciless, glaring off metal and dirt alike. Frank had taken the old tractor across the south field to turn the soil before the first fall planting. The machine rattled loudly, more rust than engine, but it still obeyed his hands. As he passed near the ridge, something shifted beneath the earth with a sound like a muted sigh. Before he could react, the ground gave way under the right wheel. The tractor lurched violently to the side, nearly throwing him from the seat. He slammed his boots into the ground, dust exploding upward, and coughed as he steadied himself. When the dust settled, he saw the wheel stuck halfway into a fresh sinkhole. The soil had split open, revealing a jagged wound in the earth. "Damn," he muttered, rubbing his shoulder. He approached the hole cautiously. Something caught his eye, a shimmer, faint but unnatural, like polished ice catching sunlight. Frank knelt, squinting. Embedded in the broken earth was a pale, metallic-looking stone. Not silver, not quartz, something different. He reached in, pried a small chunk free, and held it in his palm. It felt strangely light, almost like a flake of solid moonlight. Frank straightened slowly, staring at it. He didn't have words for what he was seeing, but he had instincts, and they told him this was no ordinary mineral. He slipped the sample into his pocket, intending to call Elaine Harper, Mary's old college friend from the State Geological Department. She was smart, trustworthy, and, most importantly, not connected in any way to Silver Rock. And that decision, that small moment of curiosity, would be the first in a chain of events that changed the course of his life forever. But Frank didn't know that yet. He only knew that something was wrong. And as the wind picked up, sweeping across the fields with an uneasy rustle, he felt deep down that he was being pushed toward a moment he couldn't yet see. A moment that would test every ounce of strength he had left. He walked back toward the house, the weightless stone somehow feeling heavier in his pocket with every step. The sun cast long shadows behind him, stretching across the land he'd sworn to protect. Ahead, he could almost hear Mary's voice whispering like wind through the grass. Whatever was coming, he wasn't ready. But he would have to be. Because this land, his land, had begun whispering back, and those whispers would soon lead straight into the storm gathering on the horizon, pulling him into the next chapter of a future he never asked for, but would have no choice but to face. Frank could feel the weight of the strange stone in his pocket long after he reached the house. It didn't weigh much, not physically, but it felt like it had carved a new space inside him, something unsettled and unspoken. He placed it gently on the kitchen table, staring at the pale shard as though it might reveal its secrets if he glared hard enough. The morning sun slanted across it, painting it in soft silver and making it nearly glow. He sat heavily in his chair, rubbing the back of his neck, trying to push down the unease rising in him like a slow tide. He needed answers. It took him nearly 10 minutes to gather his thoughts enough to dial the number. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered, a voice warm with the tone of someone who had once been close to Mary, and who, by extension, had become an extended piece of family. "Frank? What a surprise," said Elaine Harper. She sounded breathless, probably rushing between labs or meetings. "Everything all right out there?" "Not exactly," Frank replied, eyes fixed on the shimmering stone. "I found something. Something I think you ought to look at." There was a pause. "Found something? What kind of something?" "I don't know," he said truthfully. "But it's not dirt, and it's not rock. Least not like anything I've seen. Could be mineral." Another pause, longer this time, the kind that holds curiosity. "All right, Frank, describe it." He tried, fumbling for words that felt insufficient. "It's light, pale, shiny, like metal but not metal. Looks like it belongs in one of your labs, not in a cow pasture." Elaine chuckled softly. Well, send it over. I'll run a few tests. Frank didn't need convincing. He wrapped the shard in an old cloth, tucked it into a padded envelope, and drove straight into town, mailing it express. He would have forgotten about it, forced himself to shove the worry aside, if it weren't for the feeling that someone, somewhere, was already waiting for him to make that exact move. That night, as he sat on the porch, sipping lukewarm coffee and staring into the dark fields, the faint sound of an engine rumbled somewhere near the main road. A pair of dim headlights passed slowly, too slowly for a car merely driving by. He couldn't see the license plate, but he saw the shape, a dark SUV, the kind city men liked, the kind he'd seen earlier that day. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just watched, hands gripping the armrests until his knuckles whitened. When the lights finally faded, he released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He muttered under his breath, "Trouble's looking closer every damn day." 2 mornings later, the phone rang before sunrise. Frank wiped sleep from his eyes and answered. "Frank." It was Elaine. Her voice was tight, thin, breathless. "I need to come out there. Today." He stiffened. "That bad?" "That important," she said. "I'll be there before noon." She hung up without another word. Frank stood in the silent kitchen, the dawn creeping in through the window, painting the counter in long streaks of orange. Something in her tone stirred something deep in him, something like a warning. He stepped outside to distract himself, focusing on his chores, but every clank of metal, every lowing of cattle, felt overshadowed by the anticipation of what Elaine would say. Even the sky seemed tense, clouds hovering low as though they too were waiting. By the time he spotted her old blue Subaru crawling up the dirt road, his chest felt tight with dread. The car parked close to the porch, and Elaine climbed out, clutching a file so thick it bowed in the middle. She stepped onto the porch without greeting, pushing her glasses up the bridge of her nose. "We need to talk," she said. Frank stepped aside and let her in. They sat at the kitchen table, the file sitting between them like a sleeping animal neither dared wake. Elaine reached inside and pulled out several printed sheets, diagrams, mineral analysis charts, and more technical jargon than Frank had seen in a decade. "This," she said, tapping the first page, "is not something you find on the surface. It's something you find deep underground, very deep." Frank frowned. "What is it?" "Lithium," she said simply. "High-density, high-purity lithium." He stared at her blankly. She leaned forward. "Frank, lithium is one of the most valuable minerals in the world right now. Every phone, every car, every clean energy battery, they all need it. We're talking massive industrial interest, governments, corporations, investors." Frank's lips tightened. "Expensive stuff, you mean?" "Incredibly expensive," she confirmed. "But that's not even the biggest part." She turned another page, revealing dense graphs and a 3D geological survey. "The concentration I found in your sample isn't normal. It suggests a larger deposit. A much larger deposit. Possibly one of the biggest in the region, if not beyond." She paused, letting that sink in. Frank felt his pulse thrum. "You're telling me there's money in my dirt?" Elaine gave him a look. "Frank, there's a fortune under your ranch. Not a little, not a lot, a fortune. Maybe billions." The word hung there, almost surreal. Billions. Frank felt his world tilt, as though the floor shifted even though nothing had moved. He leaned back, eyes drifting toward the window where the fields stretched endlessly, the land he'd tended, repaired, and loved with his bare hands for decades. "Billions," he repeated quietly, almost to himself. Elaine nodded. "And something else. You need to be careful." Frank blinked. "Careful? Of what?" She hesitated, lowering her voice. "Silver Rock. They've been bidding aggressively across multiple counties, Mining rights, land rights. They've been sending agents to scout locations. I checked into them. They're not just real estate developers. They've been lobbying for mineral contracts. Frank, I think they know or suspect something about your land. He exhaled slowly. The SUV from the night before flickered in his mind like a ghostly reminder. Told them no once already, he murmured. Elaine's expression tightened. Then they'll push harder. Frank stood and walked to the window, staring out at the land Mary had loved and protected. Every shadow, every blade of grass felt different now, heavier with meaning. Beneath all of it lay a secret bigger than anything he'd ever imagined. The earth seemed to hum with a new kind of energy, as if everything hidden beneath the surface had awakened. He swallowed hard. What am I supposed to do with all this? Elaine closed the file. First, get proper legal representation. Second, don't sign anything. And third, don't tell anyone. Not yet. Not until we know exactly how big this deposit is. He nodded, slowly, like a man trying to make peace with something incomprehensible. She stood, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. Frank, this could change your life, but it could also put you in danger. I ain't afraid of danger, he said, though a tremor ran under his words. She squeezed his shoulder gently. Good, because the wrong people would kill to get their hands on land like this. She left shortly after that, dust trailing behind her car as it disappeared down the long road. Frank watched until he couldn't see the taillights anymore. Then he sat back down at the kitchen table. The house felt too quiet now. It took several minutes before he moved again. When he did, he went straight to the pantry, pulling out the small lockbox where he kept the few important things left from his marriage. Mary's letters, her wedding ring, a picture from their first year on the ranch. He opened the lid with trembling hands and placed the shimmering stone gently inside, as though placing it with her memory would keep it safe. He locked the box. Then he stood and paced, a restless energy crawling under his skin. His world had changed. And as twilight settled over the ranch, bringing the first hints of night, Frank realized that change wasn't arriving softly. It was arriving like a storm. The next morning, he woke with a heaviness he couldn't shake. He stepped outside and found fresh tire tracks along the road, the kind that didn't belong to him. Someone had come through the night, or parked, or watched. He spent the day repairing fences and checking cattle, but his mind drifted constantly to the sinkhole, the mineral, the hidden fortune, and the men who wanted his land desperately enough to send inspectors, threats, and dark SUVs creeping through the night. By sunset, when he walked back to the house with sore shoulders and dirt under his nails, he saw something waiting on his porch. An envelope. Unmarked. He picked it up cautiously, glancing around the dimming yard. The cicadas droned loudly, drowning out the whispering fear rising inside him. He tore the envelope open and unfolded the single sheet of paper. You don't know what you're holding. This is your final warning. Sell or regret. Frank crushed the paper in his fist. Cowards, he muttered. That night he couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch with the shotgun across his lap, watching the horizon for headlights, listening for engines that didn't come. The stars looked sharp and cold above him, the wide Texas sky stretching like a vast and indifferent witness. He thought of Mary. What would she tell him? She'd tell him to fight. She'd tell him the land mattered, that their home mattered, that worth wasn't measured in dollars but in roots, roots sunk deep into soil, memory, and love. He held her memory tight as the darkness thickened, refusing to let fear dictate his choices. But even he couldn't deny that the world he'd known was slipping away. Around him, the night seemed to pulse with an unfamiliar tension, as though the land itself was bracing for something. And before dawn even painted its first line across the sky, Frank understood that his life was no longer a quiet one. Forces bigger than him, bigger than anything he'd ever imagined, were already moving. He was going to have to move too. The storm was coming, and the next chapter of his life was already stirring in the early light. Frank had always believed dawn was the safest hour, a thin strip of peace stretched between the dangers of night and the noise of day. But when he stepped out onto the porch that morning, the quiet didn't feel peaceful. It felt watchful, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The envelope from the night before still lay crumpled in his jacket pocket, its edges damp from sweat. He'd barely slept. Every croak of a night insect, every shifting shadow, had felt like a pair of eyes staring through the darkness. The shotgun rested beside his chair, a silent companion he hadn't needed in years. Now he kept it close the way a drowning man holds onto driftwood. He scanned the horizon. The world looked unchanged. Endless fields painted gold by the rising sun, the faint lowing of cattle waking one another, a breeze dragging thin trails of dust along the fence line. But something had shifted, not in the land, but in him. Beneath the surface of the ordinary morning, the truth he carried felt radioactive, heavy, alive. Somewhere under his boots, beneath the soil and clay and limestone, was a fortune big enough to twist the future of states, maybe even entire industries. A fortune others already knew about. A fortune they were willing to harass, threaten, manipulate, maybe worse, to possess. And Frank Miller was standing between them and it. He rubbed the back of his neck, trying to ease the tension knotted there, then walked down the porch steps and headed toward the barn. The cattle needed tending, and for a few minutes he welcomed the distraction. Work demanded focus, and focus kept fear at bay. The barn doors groaned as he opened them, dust motes swirling in the sunlight streaming through the rafters. He filled the feed buckets one by one, his hands moving automatically through the motions he'd practiced thousands of times. But his mind was elsewhere. Every metallic scrap of sound made him flinch. Every echo seemed unfamiliar. As he stepped back outside with the feed, he noticed something that stopped him cold. Tire tracks. Fresh ones. Cutting across the field near the creek, where no truck should have been. He set down the bucket slowly, his heartbeat thrumming in his ears. The tracks led toward the ridge, toward the sinkhole where he'd found the mineral. Someone had been there. Recently. He followed the tracks, his boots pressing into the soft dirt. The sun climbed higher, blistering the world in its bright grip. When he reached the ridge, he saw the sinkhole had changed. The soil was disturbed, not naturally from erosion or wind, but from someone digging. Signs of shovels. Footprints. A cigarette butt pressed into the mud. Jaw burning tight with anger, Frank crouched and picked up the butt. It was branded with a foreign label he didn't recognize. Not a local smoker, not a ranch hand. This was someone who'd never stepped foot on land like his before this very moment. They had come for the mineral. They were searching. And they were close. He rose slowly, tension rippling under his skin like coiled wire. A rancher learned to read signs, tracks, disturbances, changes in patterns. Whoever had been here knew what they were looking for. They weren't scavengers. They weren't kids or wanderers or lost tourists. They were professionals. Frank felt a tremor pass through him. Part fear, part fury. He stood for a long time, staring down at the disrupted earth, the vast silence pressing against him like a closing hand. Mary would have known what to do. She always knew how to calm him, how to remind him that no matter how big the world's troubles became, they were still just two people standing on their own soil. But Mary wasn't here, and the world's troubles were growing bigger by the hour. As he walked back toward the house, a sharp ringing shattered the silence. His phone. He yanked it from his pocket, expecting Elaine, but instead saw an unfamiliar number. His thumb hovered over the screen. Part of him didn't want to answer. Curiosity won. "Yeah?" he said brusquely. A pause, then a voice that sounded too smooth to be honest, too calm to be genuine. "Mr. Miller," the voice said, "I believe we may have gotten off on the wrong foot." Frank's stomach tightened. Langley, Silver Rock. He didn't respond. The man continued, his tone oily and polite. "We understand you're a man of principle. That's admirable. Truly. But we're hoping you'll reconsider our offer." Frank clenched his jaw. "I already told you. The land ain't for sale." A sigh floated through the receiver. "Everything is for sale, Mr. Miller. It's simply a matter of negotiation." Frank's grip on the phone tightened. "Then hear this real clear. Negotiation's over." A pause, a shift, a subtle drop in temperature, like the world on the other side of the line had just hardened. "That's very unfortunate," Langley said, voice lower now. "We want to handle this civilly, but some matters cannot be delayed forever. For your sake, I hope you'll come to your senses." Frank forced himself to breathe as the call ended. His hand trembled, and he shoved the phone deep into his pocket to hide it from himself, as if seeing the device would somehow amplify the threat. His first instinct was to call Elaine, but he didn't want to drag her into something dangerous. She'd already done enough. Instead, he walked back into the house, poured himself a cup of water, and sat heavily in the old wooden chair. He needed someone who understood law, land, and how to fight powerful men without getting crushed. He rummaged through a drawer, searching until he found the worn business card tucked beneath old receipts and bills. Thomas Yates, attorney, property disputes, rural rights, mineral law. Thomas wasn't just any lawyer. He'd represented half the ranchers within 100 miles at some point. Smart, honest, fierce when needed. Frank dialed the number. Thomas answered on the second ring, his voice gruff with sleep or too much work. "Yates." "Thomas, it's Frank Miller." "Well, I'll be damned." "Frank, been years. What can I do for you?" Frank hesitated, unsure how much to say over the phone. "I need help, and maybe protection. Got some folks trying to force me off my land." A pause. "Silver Rock?" Frank's heart skipped. "You know them?" "Know of them," Thomas said. "Enough to know you ain't the first rancher they've come after, but usually they get what they want before it gets ugly." "This might get ugly anyway," Frank murmured. "Then you better come see me today." Frank agreed, hung up, and prepared to drive into town. But first, he opened the lockbox and looked at the shimmering shard one more time. He didn't take it with him, didn't dare, but he studied it as though it held answers to questions he hadn't yet formed. He locked the box carefully, slid it back into the pantry's hidden compartment, and pulled the panel closed. Then he grabbed his keys, walked outside, and climbed into his truck. The drive to town was quiet, save for the rattling of the old engine and the distant cry of birds above the vast open fields. But the whole way, Frank felt eyes. Not real ones, no headlights, no vehicles, but the sense of presence, subtle and unnerving, like a predator waiting beyond tall grass. When he arrived at Thomas Yates's office, a squat brick building with faded paint, he parked and walked inside. The receptionist nodded him through, and Thomas greeted him with a firm handshake and a raised eyebrow. "You look like hell," Thomas said. "Feel worse," Frank replied. They sat. Thomas pressed his glasses higher on his nose and leaned forward. "Tell me everything." Frank did. The visits, the sinkhole, the mineral, Elaine's report, the envelope, the footprints, the tire tracks, the threatening call that morning. Thomas listened without interruption, though his expression grew more serious with every detail. When Frank finished, Thomas leaned back and blew out a slow breath. "Damn." "That bad?" Frank asked. Thomas shook his head. "Frank, Silver Rock isn't just some real estate group. They're tied into energy projects, investment groups, political donors. If they know about the lithium, and it sounds like they do, they'll stop at nothing to secure it. They want control over that land before it becomes public knowledge. If the government steps in or other companies catch wind, Silver Rock loses their chance. What do? You fight, Thomas said simply. But you can't fight alone. Frank nodded slowly. I'll file injunctions, Thomas continued. Property protection notices. I'll make it as legally messy as possible for them to breathe in your direction. But this won't stop them. It'll only slow them down. Frank swallowed. I just want to keep my land. I know, Thomas said gently. But you're holding a gold mine, and gold mines draw wolves. Frank left the office with more weight on his shoulders than when he arrived. But at least now the weight had structure. Legal paperwork, protection filings, and advice from someone who didn't scare easily. But nothing prepared him for what waited at home. As he pulled into the ranch driveway, his truck slowed, tires crunching over gravel. Something felt wrong immediately. The barn door wasn't fully shut. The fence gate hung open, and near the porch, a rock. A rock with paper wrapped around it. His breath caught. He climbed out, approached slowly, and unwrapped the note. This time the message wasn't typed. It was handwritten, rushed, aggressive. Last chance. Sell before nightfall. You've been warned. Frank's gaze lifted to the empty yard, the stretching fields, the tree line beyond. A shiver crawled across his spine. They were watching. They could be anywhere. He took the note, crumpled it, and shoved it into his pocket. Then he moved quickly, closing the gate, shutting the barn, checking the cattle. Everything seemed intact, but the sense of violation remained, a bitter taste he couldn't swallow. As dusk approached, he locked the windows, closed the curtains, loaded the shotgun. The land outside darkened slowly, the shadows stretching long like fingers pulling across the fields. He sat on the porch again, but this time with the lamp off. Darkness cloaked him as he watched the horizon. Hours passed. Crickets sang. The wind rustled through the grass. And then he heard it. A distant engine. The crunch of gravel. A vehicle slowing. Frank stiffened, gripping the shotgun. The engine stopped somewhere near the ridge. Faint voices drifted on the wind, muffled but unmistakable. Men. More than one. They were back. He stood, body tense, heart pounding, but he didn't walk toward them. Something inside him shifted, a realization more powerful than fear. They weren't here to talk. They weren't here to negotiate. They were searching, digging, trespassing, stealing. Frank stepped back inside the house, grabbed the phone, and dialed the sheriff's office. But the line rang 6 times before cutting to a recorded message. No answer. He tried again. Same result. His stomach clenched. Either they were busy, or someone had interfered. He hung up, wiped sweat from his brow, and took a shaky breath. He wasn't a young man anymore. He wasn't a soldier, a fighter, or a man built for violence. But he was a rancher, and ranchers protect what's theirs. He grabbed his flashlight, tightened his grip on the shotgun, and stepped back outside into the dark. The next chapter of his life was waiting for him in the shadows of his own land, and he knew the moment he took another step, nothing would ever be the same again. Frank stepped into the night like a man walking into the open jaws of something old and patient. The sky above was a sprawling black canvas scattered with faint stars that flickered like distant warnings. The air was dry, crisp enough to make each breath feel sharp in his lungs. His flashlight bobbed slightly in his left hand, and the shotgun in his right weighed heavier than it ever had before. Not because of age or rust, but because he knew the moment he brought it, everything between him and Silver Rock had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The voices near the ridge drifted toward him again, faint but unmistakable. 2, maybe 3 men. Their tones low and hurried, not casual conversation. Men working, men searching. The crunch of metal against rock echoed softly across the fields. They were digging. They were after the lithium. After the fortune buried beneath soil that belonged to him and Mary, soil watered by decades of sweat and love and loss. Frank moved forward. The moon was only a thin sliver, barely slicing light across the plains, but the flashlight's narrow beam cut a path through the darkness. He kept it angled low, careful not to give away his position. Instinct guided his movements. A lifetime spent reading tracks, animals, storm patterns. Now he read danger in the same quiet language. He approached the ridge slowly, boots sinking into softer earth as he neared the sinkhole. The edges of the land still bore signs of the previous disturbance. Footprints pressed deep, shovels scraping, the uneven mound of soil displaced by searching hands. But now there were fresh impressions, fresh prints, fresh tools, and fresh intruders. Frank crouched behind a cluster of scrubby mesquite bushes, steadying his breath. Ahead, near the collapse site, 3 dark shapes moved. Their flashlights flickered like insects, small cones of light skittering across the dirt. One man knelt at the edge of the sinkhole, digging deeper. Another stood guard, scanning the horizon. The third hovered over a device, some kind of portable scanner, its faint electronic chirps rising and falling. Whatever they were doing, it wasn't random. It was organized. They knew exactly what they were looking for. Frank's jaw tightened. He had never been a man who looked for trouble, but he was damn sure not the kind of man who let it walk across his land like it owned the place. He moved slightly, leaves brushing against his shoulder. A snapping twig beneath his boot echoed louder than a gunshot in the silence. The guard's flashlight whipped toward the sound. Frank froze. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, landing just shy of the mesquite where he crouched. The guard stepped forward cautiously, hand resting on something at his belt. Not a radio, a weapon. Frank held his breath so long his lungs burned. His heart beat so hard he could feel it against the barrel of the shotgun. The guard took one more step, scanning the area. His breath puffed in small clouds in the cold air. Frank imagined the man's finger hovering just above the trigger, waiting for a sign of movement. Seconds stretched like rope pulled taut. Then one of the other men spoke sharply. "Leave it, animal tracks, we gotta keep moving." The guard hesitated, then turned back. Frank exhaled finally, silently, and gripped the shotgun tighter. The man with the scanner spoke again. "It's down there. I'm telling you, the readings are spiking. This is the place." The one digging grunted. "Then we dig faster." Frank's blood went cold. They had some sort of geological locator. Silver Rock wasn't guessing. They weren't gambling. They already knew the deposit existed and had pinpointed it enough to send a search team in the dead of night. He felt something inside him crack. Something tired. Something wounded. Something fiercely protective. He rose slowly, stepping out from behind the mesquite, keeping the flashlight off. He held the shotgun steady, barrel angled toward the sky, but ready. "Get off my land!" His voice rang through the night like a strike of thunder. The men jolted, 2 stumbling, 1 dropping his shovel. Flashlights swung wildly, turning the darkness into a frantic kaleidoscope of light. The guard's hand went instantly to his sidearm. Frank took a step forward, planting his boots firmly. "I said," he repeated, louder this time, "get off my land." The guard pointed his gun toward Frank, but the oldest of the 3, balding, with the tired posture of someone accustomed to giving orders, raised a hand. "Easy," the older man said. "Mr. Miller, right? We're just trespassing," Frank snapped. "Just digging, just stealing." The man smiled faintly, an attempt at disarming charm that only made Frank's grip tighten. "Let's calm down, sir. No one's here to hurt anyone. We're simply conducting a survey. On land that ain't yours." The man's smile twitched. "Land that may soon change hands." Frank raised the shotgun, not pointing it directly at them, but enough to make the message clear. You have 10 seconds to leave. The guards stiffened. They hadn't expected resistance, certainly not armed resistance from an old rancher in the middle of the night. The one with the scanner muttered something under his breath. The older man tried again. "Mr. Miller, this doesn't need to escalate. We're not the enemy here." Frank steadied his stance. "But you're sure as hell not friends." "Look," the man said, voice lowering. "We're on a schedule. We don't have time for this." "Then you better run," Frank said quietly. The guard cursed. The older man snapped, "Pack it up!" The three men exchanged hurried glances, then scrambled to gather their equipment. As they retreated, the guard kept his weapon half raised, watching Frank with cold hostility. But none of them fired. None of them dared. Frank stepped forward a few paces, watching until their silhouettes faded into the darkness and the rumble of an engine drifted away across the plains. Only then did he lower the shotgun. His hands trembled. He wasn't afraid of guns, not after a lifetime handling them. But he wasn't stupid either. These weren't local troublemakers. These weren't burglars or vandals. These were trained, coordinated, funded. The kind of people who didn't retreat because they were threatened. They retreated because they hadn't been authorized yet. Frank stared at the churned-up earth, the deep scars their shovels had left. The sinkhole looked larger now, raw and violated. Beneath it all, the lithium gleamed unseen, a silent prize in a war Frank had never wanted to fight. He knelt and pressed a hand to the ground, breathing deeply. The soil was cool, the faint scent of minerals rising like a ghost from the wound. He felt the weight of everything Elaine had told him, everything Thomas had warned him about, and the growing certainty that whatever this was, it was no longer just about protecting a ranch. This was about surviving. He stood again, steadying himself, and walked back toward the house. His steps were slow, his thoughts heavy. He felt older than he had in years, the burden of impending battle digging into the bones of a man who had lived a quiet life for far too long. When he reached the porch, he leaned the shotgun against the railing and sat in his old chair. The wood creaked under him, familiar as an old dog settling beside its master. He rubbed his face, exhausted, but too wired to sleep. Then he noticed something glowing faintly in the dark. A red dot. Laser sight. Moving slowly up the front wall of his house. His breath caught in his throat. He ducked behind the porch pillar just as the dot drifted toward where his chest had been seconds earlier. His heart slammed against his ribs. Someone hadn't left. Someone had stayed behind with a weapon. Watching, waiting, deciding whether to take a shot. He stayed still, barely breathing. Minutes passed, long, agonizing ones. Finally, the red dot disappeared. Footsteps crunched softly through the grass. Then silence. He didn't move for a full 5 minutes, listening for any sign of the watcher. Only after he was sure they had gone did he crawl toward the door, gripping the shotgun with white-knuckled hands, slip inside and lock it behind him. This wasn't pressure anymore. This was war. He sank onto the floor, back pressed against the door, legs shaking. He needed help. Real help. The kind that could stand against a corporation with hired men and unlimited resources. But even as he reached for his phone to call Thomas or Elaine, something stopped him. An instinct. A whisper of danger. He set the phone down. If someone had been aiming at him tonight, they might have tapped his lines. They might have infiltrated the sheriff's office. They might know everything he said, did, or planned. He couldn't rely on systems anymore. Only himself. Only the land. Only the promises he had left. He stayed awake all night, shotgun across his lap, eyes fixed on the window where the red dot had wandered. Shadows crawled across the floor as dawn approached, each one a reminder of how close death had come. When morning finally broke, the sunlight looked harsher than usual, like it too carried a warning. Frank stood slowly, stretching his stiff spine. He poured himself coffee, though his hands shook so badly he spilled half of it. He walked outside and froze. Parked near his gate, plain as day, was a new black SUV. Not hidden, not subtle. A declaration, a statement. Standing in front of it, leaning casually against the grille, was Richard Langley. Dressed in another immaculate suit, tie perfectly knotted, expression cool and composed, as if their men hadn't just tried to steal from him or kill him the night before. "Morning, Mr. Miller," Langley said, smiling like a snake in church. "We need to talk." Frank stood still as stone, because he knew this was no longer a negotiation. This was the beginning of the next battle, and the next chapter was already reaching for him. Frank didn't move. He stood in the open yard, the early sun hard and unforgiving behind him, turning the dust into gold flecks floating between him and the man who threatened everything he had left. Richard Langley, polished as a blade, folded his arms and waited as though he were greeting an old acquaintance, rather than confronting a man whose life he'd tried to ruin. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind brushed the long grass with the softness of a whisper. The cattle shifted far in the distance, and the screen door behind Frank trembled quietly. The old ranch house seemed to hold its breath. Finally, Frank broke the silence. "You sure got nerve," he said, voice low, gravelly from a night without sleep and a heart full of rage. Langley smiled the thin kind of smile men wear when they believe they hold all the cards. "Nerve," he echoed, nodding slightly. "Some might call it professionalism." "Some might call it trespass," Frank snapped back. "That was an unfortunate misunderstanding," Langley replied calmly, as though the men on Frank's land last night hadn't nearly shot him, "which is why I'm here personally, to clear the air." Frank stepped forward once, closing some of the distance between them. "I ain't got air to clear with you." Langley didn't flinch. He stood smooth, composed, unbothered. "Frank," he said, using the name like they were familiar, "you're a smart man, a grounded man. So let's be honest with each other." Frank's jaw hardened. "Honest? You send men to dig through my land. You send them back in the middle of the night. Then someone points a rifle at my damn house." He lifted one hand, pointing at the dirt beneath his boots. "And now you want to stand here and play neighborly?" Langley's eyes flickered, but his expression stayed level. "We didn't authorize violence." "That's so?" Frank growled. "Then you got rogue dogs running around your leash." "Every organization has enthusiastic individuals," Langley replied. "But the point stands. We prefer cooperation. It's cleaner." "Cleaner," Frank repeated with a bitter laugh. "Cleaner than murder?" A small shift, so quick most men wouldn't catch it, passed through Langley's face. Not guilt, not shame, just annoyance, like Frank was inconveniencing him with the truth. "Frank," he said again, smoothing a hand over his tie, "you're standing on something that's worth more than either of us should be discussing out in the open. You know it, and you know why we're here, why we've tried to expedite matters." Frank folded his arms, his silhouette rigid and immovable. "You're here because you don't think the law applies to you." Langley sighed softly, glancing around the land as though surveying a property he already considered purchased. "This isn't about law. This is about progress, national interest, economic necessity. The world is moving forward, and this land, your land, is part of that movement. It's inevitable." "Nothing inevitable about someone taking what ain't theirs," Frank replied. Langley's smile returned, thin, brittle now. "Perhaps, but inevitability doesn't wait for permission." The words hung there, cold and sharp. Frank felt something inside him tighten, like a rope pulled taut. He took one more step toward Langley until only a few feet separated them. "I ain't afraid of you." "And you should be," Langley said softly, so softly Frank almost didn't hear it. "Because you're alone." Frank flinched just slightly, as though the words hit harder than a bullet. Alone. Yes. Mary was gone. His nearest neighbor was miles away. The sheriff wouldn't pick up. The county was half paid by corporations, and Frank knew, deep in his bones, that what Langley said was meant to cut deeper than any threat. But Frank wasn't the kind of man who backed down because someone told him he stood alone. He squared his shoulders. Alone don't mean weak. Langley studied him, the moment stretching between them like an invisible rope tugged by both ends. Then Langley exhaled slowly. We have an offer. I ain't selling. You haven't heard the number. Don't need to. Langley tilted his head. This is more money than you could spend in 3 lifetimes. Frank didn't blink. Money don't matter when you're dead and buried. Langley narrowed his eyes. Everyone has a price. Not me. And for the first time since he arrived, Langley's composure cracked. Not fully, just a small fracture in the polished mask he wore. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Listen carefully, Mr. Miller. Nothing good comes from getting in the way of people with bigger plans than you. Frank didn't back down. He leaned forward slightly. Then maybe they ought to make smaller plans. Langley stared at him for a long moment. Then he straightened, smoothing the suit jacket over his shoulders. You'll regret this. Frank's eyes burned with a fire he hadn't felt in years. Not half as much as you will. Langley's jaw tightened. He motioned to the SUV. The vehicle's tinted windows gleamed darkly under the sun as it hummed to life. The moment the door shut behind him, Langley rolled down the window and spoke one last time. Even the strongest walls crumble, Frank. It's just a matter of pressure. Frank stepped forward, gripping the shotgun he'd left leaning against the porch column. This wall won't. Langley's gaze moved to the shotgun, then back to Frank's eyes. Something like irritation flashed there, then vanished under that smooth corporate veneer. Goodbye, Mr. Miller, he said at last. The SUV pulled away in a spray of dirt and gravel, the tires spitting dust into the morning air. Frank watched until it disappeared over the hill. Only when the last trace of the engine's growl faded did he finally let out the breath he'd been holding. Then he turned and went inside. The house felt colder now, the shadows longer despite the sun. He paced slowly across the wooden floor, every board creaking beneath the weight of decisions he hadn't wanted to make. He found himself drifting to the lockbox again. He slid the panel aside, lifted the metal lid, and stared at the pale shard inside. The mineral almost shimmered even in the dim light. Not sparkling like gold or glowing like a crystal, just existing, quietly, radiating a sense of value that had already poisoned his life. It didn't look like something that could ruin a man, but it could. It was. He closed the box with a soft click. He knew he couldn't stay quiet anymore. He knew he needed to act before Silver Rock tightened their grip further. So he called Thomas Yates. This time, the lawyer answered on the first ring. Frank, you all right? No, Frank admitted. Langley came to my house. They were digging again last night, and someone pointed a rifle at me. Thomas cursed under his breath. Jesus Christ. Okay, all right, listen. Pack a bag and get into town. We need to file emergency injunctions, protection orders, environmental holds, anything we can. And we need to get ahead of this, before they escalate. Escalate? Frank asked, voice dark. They already tried once, Thomas said. You think they're gonna stop? Frank closed his eyes. He could still see the red dot sliding across his home, still feel the cold weight of being hunted on his own porch. I'll head in, he said finally. No, Thomas said sharply. Don't come alone. I'll send someone. Stay inside. Lock the doors. But Frank wasn't in the mood to wait for rescue. The land wasn't just dirt. It wasn't just acreage. It was the only thing tethering him to the world, to Mary, to sanity, and he wouldn't abandon it. He hung up, grabbed his jacket, and stepped outside. He took one last scan of the horizon, checking for movement, for shadows, for any sign of the black SUVs. The world seemed still, too still. He climbed into his truck and drove toward town. The road was long and empty, stretching like a scar across the plains. Dust plumed behind him, swirling in pale spirals. Every mile felt like a tightening heartbeat. Every fence post felt like a silent witness. Halfway to town, he noticed a car in his rearview mirror. At first, it was just a dark shape far behind him, but as he drove, it crept closer. Slowly. Too slowly to be casual. Frank gripped the steering wheel tighter. He turned onto a back road, one only locals used. The car followed. He sped up. The car stayed the same distance behind him, never closer, never farther. Watching. Hurting. Frank's pulse quickened. The last thing he wanted was a confrontation alone on a back road with no witnesses. So he did something unexpected. He pulled off suddenly into a narrow lane crowded with mesquite and oak trees, tires spitting gravel. The car sped past the turn, unprepared for the sudden maneuver. Frank breathed, gripping the wheel until his knuckles turned white. They hadn't expected him to turn. Good. Let them lose him. He stayed hidden between the trees for several minutes until the sound of the car's engine faded into the distance. Only then did he take the long route, weaving through unfamiliar paths, avoiding the main roads until he finally reached town. Thomas's office came into view, small, squat, reliable, like the man himself. Frank parked and went inside. Thomas greeted him immediately with eyes widened. "What the hell happened? You look like you outran a devil." "Maybe I did," Frank muttered, sinking into the chair. Thomas didn't waste time. He laid out forms, legal documents, injunction requests. He explained the paths forward, slow, bureaucratic, full of pitfalls and delays. Frank listened quietly but with rising frustration. "Legal won't be enough," he finally said, interrupting Thomas mid-sentence. Thomas stopped. "Frank, you know it. I know it. They got money, influence. They can stall anything you file. They can twist judges, bribe officials, bury paperwork." Thomas's eyes hardened, but he didn't argue. Frank leaned closer. "I need more than law. I need leverage." Thomas hesitated. "What kind of leverage?" Frank closed his eyes, fighting through the exhaustion. "Proof. Of the deposit. Of illegal activity. Something that puts them on the defense." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then we need documentation. Geological validation. Surveys, witnesses, evidence of trespassing. Or, Frank said softly, "we expose them." Thomas froze. "Expose them to who?" Frank opened his eyes. "To everyone." Thomas stared at him. Then, slowly, he nodded. "A media leak. Public exposure. Force them into a corner." Frank nodded back. But as Thomas explained the risks and strategies, a weight grew in Frank's chest. Because exposing Silver Rock meant escalating the conflict beyond threats and intimidation. It meant war in the open, and war had casualties. When Frank finally stood to leave, Thomas grabbed his arm. "Be careful. They won't sit quietly once they know you're fighting back." Frank managed a tired smile. "They already know." He left the office and stepped into the fading afternoon light. The sky carried the soft pink hues of impending dusk. People passed him on the sidewalk, ordinary townsfolk, unaware of the battle brewing at their doorstep. Frank climbed into his truck. As he started the engine, he noticed something tucked under his windshield wiper. A note. He tore it free, unfolding it carefully. One sentence. "You can't run from what's coming." Frank's heart hammered. He looked around. No one. No car. No witness. Only the quiet certainty that Silver Rock was already 2 steps ahead. He crumpled the note and threw it on the passenger seat. As he drove home under a sky bruised with twilight, he felt the world closing in. The land around him no longer felt like a sanctuary, but a battlefield waiting for the next shot. And though he didn't know it yet, the next chapter of his story was not going to wait long before slamming into him with the force of everything the world had been saving up. Something darker was coming, something bigger, something that would push him past every limit he'd ever known. The sun slipped lower on the horizon, staining the sky in long streaks of amber and blood orange as Frank drove the rattling old truck back toward the ranch. The wind had picked up, sweeping across the plains with a restless urgency that seemed to echo the beat of his heart. Every fence post flew past like a memory, every shadow along the road a whisper of something closing in. The note left under his windshield still burned in his pocket. You can't run from what's coming. He wasn't running. He was going home. The tires crunched over the gravel as he pulled into his driveway. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Too deep, too heavy. Not the peaceful quiet of evening, but the kind of void that follows after chaos has passed through and left its fingerprints behind. He stepped out of the truck, scanning the yard, the porch, the barn, every corner his eyes had memorized over decades. Nothing moved, no cattle in sight, no wind chimes stirring, not even the old wooden swing creaking on its rope. He reached the porch steps when he saw the door. Open. Just barely. A sliver. His pulse slammed into his throat. The shotgun was behind the seat in the truck. Too far now. Too late. He froze, listening. Nothing. But something in him whispered that stepping back wouldn't save him. Running wouldn't save him. This moment had been stalking its way toward him since the day the ground opened under that tractor wheel. All right, he murmured to himself. Whatever's waiting, let's get to it. He nudged the door open with one hand. The hinges groaned, an old, familiar sound, but the air inside the house felt wrong, heavy, thick, like the walls held their breath. He stepped in slow, eyes adjusting to the dim light. The living room seemed untouched. The kitchen was still. A faint scent lingered, cologne. Not his. Someone had been here. Or someone was here. He kept walking through the house, hands curled into fists, breath tight. When he reached the back hallway, he saw it. The pantry door open wide, the wood panel housing the hidden compartment pried off and lying on the floor. And the lockbox. Gone. The weight in his chest dropped like a stone. Footsteps creaked behind him. Looking for this? Frank turned. Standing in the doorway was Langley, holding the lockbox in one hand, a quiet triumph darkening his eyes. Two other men flanked him, one with a pistol already drawn, the other blocking the hall with a silent threat in his stance. Frank forced air into his lungs. Figures you'd come slithering in here while I wasn't home. Langley stepped forward, tapping the lockbox lightly with one finger. You should secure your valuables better, Frank, especially when they're worth more than your entire county. Put it down, Frank said. His voice didn't tremble, not even now. Langley smirked. No, I think I'll keep it. Consider it an advance payment. You think whatever's in that box is the only thing you need? Frank asked, taking one small step forward. You think a sample is enough to start drilling? Enough to claim this land? Langley's jaw flexed. It's enough to get federal attention when we present a claim. Enough to trigger an investigation. Enough to say you knowingly withheld a critical mineral deposit from the state. Frank shook his head. You don't want the law. You want it quiet. You want it secret. You want it yours. Langley raised the lockbox. And now it is. Frank took another step closer. No, it ain't. The guard lifted the pistol. Stop. Frank did. But only because he saw something else in the corner of Langley's grin. Impatience. Desperation. A crack forming in the polished shell. Frank realized then that they were not calm. They were not in control. They were scrambling now, racing against every second before Frank could expose them. They weren't wolves. They were cornered. Langley opened the lockbox with a theatrical flourish. The pale shard of lithium gleamed faintly under the dim hallway light. "There it is," Langley whispered, almost reverently. "The beginning of a new empire." Frank stared at the mineral, feeling an ache deep in his chest. "That ain't an empire," he said softly. "That's a curse." Langley scoffed. "For you, maybe." Then something happened that none of them expected. The light flickered. Once, twice, and then the entire ranch was plunged into sudden darkness. The guards cursed. Langley turned sharply, losing track of Frank for just a fraction of a second. It was enough. Frank lunged. His shoulder slammed into Langley's ribs, sending the man sprawling backward. The lockbox slipped from his grasp, the contents flying. The pale shard skittered across the floor. The guard fired blindly in the dark, a deafening blast splitting the air. But Frank rolled behind the kitchen counter as the bullet tore into the wall. "Find him!" Langley snarled, coughing from the impact. Frank's mind raced. He knew the house's darkness better than they did. Every corner, every shadow, every board creak. He moved low, crouching, stepping only where he knew the old wood wouldn't betray him. He saw one guard's silhouette sweeping a flashlight beam across the room. Frank grabbed a cast-iron skillet from the counter. It wasn't a gun, but it was heavy. He waited until the flashlight beam swung past him, then burst upward, bringing the skillet down with every ounce of strength left in his body. It connected with the guard's wrist first, sending the pistol flying, then cracked across his jaw. The man dropped instantly. The room exploded with shouts. Langley yelled, "Shoot him!" The second guard fired, but Frank dove behind the table. The bullet shattered glass, spraying shards everywhere. Frank grabbed the fallen pistol. The guard swung his flashlight toward the sound, but Frank fired first. Not to kill, but to disable. The bullet hit the man's leg. He screamed and collapsed. Silence. Heavy, raw, vibrating with tension. Langley stood alone now, breathing hard, reaching frantically for the lithium shard on the floor. Frank stepped forward. "Don't," he said. Langley froze. The flashlight from the wounded guard rolled across the floor, illuminating Langley's trembling hand hovering inches above the shard. "This is bigger than you," Langley whispered, voice cracking. "Bigger than this ranch. Bigger than anything." Frank stepped closer, gun lowered but ready. "And it cost more than anything. I ain't letting you take it." Langley slowly rose. His eyes no longer gleamed with greed. They were wild now, lost, desperate. "You can't fight us all. You can't stop what's coming." Frank's voice softened. "Maybe not, but I can stop you." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. The ranch around them seemed to hold its breath, the walls, the furniture, the memories Mary left behind. Every ghost in the room waited. Langley glanced at the door, at the window, at the world slipping through his fingers. Then he lunged. Frank didn't hesitate. He fired. Just once. The bullet struck Langley in the shoulder, spinning him backward, knocking him to the floor. He groaned, clutching the wound. Blood seeped between his fingers. Frank approached slowly. He kicked the shard away, sending it sliding under the counter where no one could reach it. "Stay down," Frank said quietly. Not cruel, not triumphant, just tired. Langley hissed through clenched teeth. "You think you've won?" "No," Frank replied. "I think I've survived." Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, growing louder by the second. Thomas must have sent someone. Or maybe a neighbor reported gunshots. Maybe the world, for once, moved in Frank's favor. Langley slumped against the wall, defeated, the smooth arrogance drained from his face. "This isn't over," he whispered. Frank looked around at the wreckage of his kitchen, the shattered memories, the dust drifting through beams of returning light as electricity flickered back on. "No," he said quietly. "But you are." The police arrived minutes later. Thomas arrived too, breathless and pale, shouting Frank's name as officers swarmed the property. They cuffed Langley and his men. They photographed footprints, broken boards, bullet holes. They recovered the shard but treated it like evidence rather than treasure. When it was all over, when Langley was dragged bleeding into the back of a cruiser and the last officer left, Frank stood alone on the porch, staring out across the land. The sky had fully darkened now. Stars shimmered timidly above him. The wind carried a gentler touch, like the land was exhaling for the first time in days. Thomas stood beside him, hands on his hips. "You did good, Frank." Frank shook his head. "I just did what I had to." "You protected your home." Frank didn't answer. His eyes drifted to the ridge in the distance. The ground there was still wounded, still scarred. Beneath it lay a fortune enormous enough to buy kingdoms. But Frank didn't feel rich. He felt tired, and somehow freed. "You know," Thomas said softly, breaking into his thoughts, "the state's going to be all over this. The government, too. You'll have choices, partners, deals, money, real money. You could retire tomorrow." Frank smiled faintly. "I retired the day Mary died." Thomas didn't reply. Frank looked at his land, his life, washed in moonlight. The fields rustled softly, like the whole ranch was whispering. He thought of Mary, her laugh, her hands in the soil, her voice on mornings drenched in golden light. "I kept it safe," he whispered to the night, "just like I promised." The wind brushed against him like a warm hand. For the first time in years, Frank felt her presence strong enough to steady him. He closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of grass and dust and the unbroken earth beneath his boots. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Legal battles, government contracts, corporate vultures circling overhead. But tonight, for the first time in months, the land was quiet, alive, protected. He walked slowly down the porch steps, letting his fingers graze the wooden railing Mary had painted herself. At the bottom, he paused, looking out across the horizon where the ranch stretched into darkness. "This land ain't for sale," he murmured. "Not now. Not ever." And as he walked back inside, the door closing gently behind him, the night settled over the Miller Ranch with a peace it hadn't known in a long, long time. The storm had passed, and dawn, someday soon, would come again.